In the year 1847, in the rural reaches of Hardin County, Kentucky, the sun had barely risen before its scorching heat bathed the red dirt square in front of the Elizabethtown courthouse. At the foot of the stone steps, 5 young women stood silently in worn-out dresses and haunted eyes. Their father, John McCulloch, a man once respected among the local Scottish-descended settlers, had squandered everything on gambling and hard liquor. Now he stood behind the sheriff, clutching a file of forfeitures. His wife was gone, debts loomed, and his daughters were about to be sold like household items. 4 girls had already been sold. Ruth, 22, was taken by an aging rancher from Breckinridge County as a wife. Lydia, 19, gentle and quiet, was handed over to a cold-eyed textile merchant in Louisville. The twin sisters, Esther and Naomi, just 17, were jointly purchased by a saloon owner from Elkhorn Tavern, with intentions as clear as the whiskey on his breath. Only Abigail McCulloch, age 16, remained. She stood with copper-brown hair catching the morning light, her eyes fierce yet trembling, as Saul Grigsby, the sly auctioneer, raised his wooden gavel and cried, "The last of the McCulloch girls, folks, who'll start at $25. No one expected that from the back of the crowd. Ezra Townsend, a middle-aged widower known for his quiet life in a wooded cabin miles away, would step forward. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't offer coin. He simply said, "I'll take her as my wife, not as my property." The Kentucky sun that day burned like salt on an open wound. In Elizabethtown, on the stone steps of the Hardin County Courthouse, the whole town seemed held hostage by a scene no one had ever dared imagine. 5 young women stood motionless, like carved figures, before a crowd of men bearing money, hunger, and calculations. To the far left stood Ruth, 22 years old, long black hair loose and dull. She had already been dragged away earlier that morning, handed off to an aging landowner from Breckinridge County, a man whose cloudy eyes had more years behind them than teeth in his mouth. Next was Lydia, the gentlest of them all, now claimed by a cold-eyed fabric merchant from Louisville. He looked at her the way he'd examine a bolt of cloth. Then came the twins, Esther and Naomi, just 17. They weren't sold separately, but as a pair, bought by a man the locals only called Snake the saloon keeper of Elkhorn Tavern. Everyone knew his $40 wasn't spent for honest work. Still standing was Abigail McCulloch, 16 years old. She stood alone, her copper-brown hair catching fire in the morning sun, shoulders narrow but unyielding, eyes fixed northward toward the fields where her mother used to lead the sisters to pick wild berries. Now, even grass refused to grow there, abandoned for too long. Saul Grigsby, the man running the auction, raised his gavel high. "Ladies and gents, the last of the McCulloch girls, 16 years, strong as a colt, cooks, stitches, keeps a garden like she was born for it." Laughter snorted from the crowd. One man shouted, "She know how to breed, too?" Abigail didn't blink. She remembered what her mother told her before fever took her 3 years ago. "Keep your back straight. Don't ever let them think you're something they can own." But her mother was long gone, and her father, John McCulloch, now stood behind a pillar like a shadow, face pale as parchment. "$25 to start," Saul barked. "$25. The first voice came from Luther Wills, the blacksmith with a scar running from ear to collarbone. "$30, another voice. "$35. The heat of bidding began. Abigail clenched her fists behind her back, fingernails digging into skin, but she did not flinch. And then, just when her fate seemed sealed, a man stepped out from the crowd. Ezra Townsend. He wasn't a regular at town events. Ezra lived alone in a cedar cabin past the woods, where wildflowers spilled onto the trail by the creek. People called him the widower, ever since his wife and infant son had died of fever the winter before. Ezra didn't stride fast. His steps were steady, his eyes locked on Abigail. Not judging, not appraising, but seeing something deeper, as if he recognized a reflection of his own shadow. He stopped. His voice was low, but it echoed across the square like the toll of an evening bell. $100. Silence cracked the crowd. Saul froze midair. Come again? I said, 100. Then Ezra added, clearly and firmly, not to own her, to marry her, with the full dignity of a wife. Murmurs rippled. Someone scoffed. Another coughed. But Abigail stood still, and for the first time that morning, her shoulders eased. Saul Grigsby's wooden gavel hung suspended midair, as if he himself couldn't quite believe what he'd heard. The square buzzed with whispers. Some townsfolk turned away, unsettled. Others stared like they were witnessing a riot in a place that usually knew only silence. Mr. Townsend, Saul rasped, I need to confirm. You're offering $100 to marry this girl? Not to purchase her as a laborer? Ezra nodded, eyes fixed on Abigail. I offer honor, not ownership. Then he turned to her, ascending the steps like he was climbing a hill laden with old burdens. If you'll agree, Abigail McCulloch, I'd like you to carry my name, not as a possession passed along, but as someone chosen, as my wife, as a partner, if you'll have it. No one spoke. Even the flies could be heard buzzing in the stillness. Abigail looked at him. The man before her wasn't handsome. He wasn't young, rich, or commanding like some frontier hero, but in his storm-gray eyes she saw something she hadn't encountered in 2 long years. Compassion, not pity. Her voice came out small, tentative. I don't know you, Ezra Townsend. He smiled gently. And I don't expect you to not today. I only ask for the chance to treat you as a human being, not a price tag. Someone clapped soft, hesitant. Then another. An elderly woman squeezed her handkerchief and nodded. Saul Grigsby, after a long breath, declared, If the girl agrees and the money's good, I don't see reason to object. Miss Abigail McCulloch, do you consent? Abigail turned, glancing at the crowd that had stood silent while her sisters were sold, while her family was dismantled piece by piece. She saw eyes avoiding hers, shame in lowered gazes, resignation in folded arms. Then she looked back at the man offering his hand, not demanding, just inviting. I agree, she said softly, but on one condition. Name it. You promise here, before everyone, that I will not be owned. I won't be a favor owed. I'll be an equal in your home, your name, and your life. Ezra placed his hand over his chest. I swear it, before God. Then, Abigail breathed in deep, then let it go. I am Abigail Townsend, from this day forward. Saul struck the block. Sold, no, completed. Miss Abigail McCulloch, now Townsend, joined to Mr. Ezra Townsend, by solemn pledge. The murmurs returned, but this time the air didn't reek of coin. It carried something almost like hope. Reverend Silas Rowe, the white-bearded minister from the local church, stepped forward when Ezra called his name. You'll officiate the wedding, right now? Right here, Ezra replied. I want no one in town to mistake her status. She's my wife. The ceremony was simple, held beneath the courthouse awning with harsh noon sunlight streaming through dusty panes. No dress, no flowers, no grand rings. Only vows, a firm handshake, and an agreement witnessed by the very people who had turned their backs hours before. Abigail became Ezra Townsend's wife, not by contract, but by choice. That afternoon, as the sun rose high, Ezra brought out his black stallion, Bishop. He leaned down and helped Abigail onto the saddle, then mounted in front of her. My place is 3 miles out, he said. Nothing fancy, but it's clean. You'll have your own room, unless or until you decide otherwise. Abigail sat behind him, arms wrapping around his waist. For the first time in many months, she wasn't afraid. The wind hit her face, grass whispered beneath hooves, and the dust of the road curled behind them. She tilted her head against Ezra's back and closed her eyes. She didn't know what the future held, But for the first time since the bidding began, she was leaving not as a commodity, but heading somewhere that might, just might, be a beginning. The dirt road curved beneath tall oaks as it carried them beyond the edge of Elizabethtown. Abigail sat behind Ezra, her arms lightly wrapped around his waist. She didn't know how to ride, but his back felt sturdy like the trunk of an old oak, and it gave her enough steadiness not to be afraid. Grass flicked at her worn hem, but she no longer cared about the world brushing against her. She was leaving behind a place that measured her worth with a wooden gavel, and for the first time, heading toward something unknown without fear. 3 miles wasn't far, but to Abigail, it felt like an entire chapter's worth of distance. When Ezra finally stopped at a plain wooden gate, her heart beat differently. Ahead stood a 3-room log house, its porch shaded by climbing morning glories and a thin wisp of smoke curling from the chimney. Beside it, a weathered stable stood quietly. A hand-pulled well leaned near the barn, and beyond, a tidy garden ran in neat rose tomatoes, green beans, onions, and a patch of vibrant purple blooms. Abigail froze. "It's beautiful," she whispered, not from politeness, but truth. Ezra smiled, dismounted, and offered his hand to help her down. "It's not much, but it's mine, and now it's yours too, if you want it to be." They stepped onto the wooden porch. The door creaked open into a warm space. A rough-hewn table, chairs padded with burlap sacks, a cast-iron stove in the corner, and a modest bookshelf dusted with time. Abigail could smell the faint mix of ashes, herbs, and loneliness. Ezra led her through the house, showing her each corner like a man revealing a memory. "This here's the kitchen," he said. "White oak burns slower in the stove. This was the front room. That's my bedroom. And—" He stopped before a small door. His hand paused on the knob, fingers still. "This room was meant for my son. I built it to be his nursery, but he didn't make it. 3 days old." His voice didn't tremble, but it was hollow. "It's yours now. Fix it up how you like." Abigail nodded. She didn't thank him out loud. She simply placed a hand gently on the door. For a moment, they stood in silence, not out of awkwardness, but because something in the past had been acknowledged with dignity. That night, as firelight danced on the log beams, Abigail wore a cotton dress Ezra had left folded in a chest. "My wife picked it out," he'd said, "but she never got to wear it." The cloth was soft, clean, and smelled faintly of cedar. To Abigail, it felt like a luxury. They sat on the porch. The prairie sky burned orange in the west. "I want to hear about your wife," Abigail said, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Ezra was quiet for a long while. Then his voice came, soft as wind. "Catherine. I met her at a church gathering in Bowling Green. Blue eyes, a springtime laugh. We had 5 good years before winter fever took her. And the baby." He clasped his hands tightly. She loved this house, said it was meant to grow life. Abigail didn't interrupt. When he finished, she only said, "I can't replace Catherine, but I do know what it is to lose." Ezra turned toward her, his eyes calm. "Catherine would have liked you, Abigail. She wanted this house filled with voices and joy, and you've brought both." The days that followed passed slow, but not heavy. Their rhythm formed naturally. Abigail handled the kitchen, swept the floors, tended the garden. Ezra worked the barn, repaired fences, gathered firewood. There were no expectations, no touching, no demands. But each evening they sat together on the porch, 2 quiet souls gradually thawing. Abigail began to laugh again when a hen charged into the house, when the dog barked at its own reflection in the well, when Ezra confessed to once nicking a cow's ear trying to trim its hair. Ezra, in turn, began to watch her, not with curiosity, but with peace. One moonlit evening, Abigail asked, "If I ever wanted to visit my sisters, what would you say?" Ezra replied, "You're my wife." But you're also free. If you want to go, I'll go with you." Abigail looked at him, then up at the stars, and for the first time, she began to picture a future where she made the choices. One May morning, as Abigail was harvesting beans from the garden behind the house, a rider approached from the direction of Elizabethtown. It was Reverend Silas Rowe, holding a parcel wrapped in linen and tied with twine. "A letter from Grayson County," he said, handing it to her. "The sender is someone named Ruth McCulloch." Abigail nodded, biting her lip. She took the letter, her hands trembling. Inside was her eldest sister's familiar handwriting. The message wasn't long, but every word was heavy with urgency. "Lydia was beaten so badly she can barely walk after trying to escape her master. Esther and Naomi are kept upstairs in a saloon. They're not allowed to leave. That man, Snake Morrison, is cruel. There are gunshots at night, screams behind locked doors. I'm the only one safe, Abby. If you can, please." The final line was scribbled hastily, as if written in fear. "Don't come alone." Abigail sat on the porch for a long time, the letter still clenched in her fist. Her heart felt torn in two, one half rooted in a peaceful home, the other screaming from a place where memory still bled. That night, after supper, as Ezra added wood to the fire, Abigail handed him the letter. He read it slowly, his brow tightening with each line. When he finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he looked up. "We'll find them. All of them." Abigail stared at him, stunned. "Even if it's dangerous? Even though they're not your blood?" Ezra placed his hand over hers. "You're my wife. They're your family. That's enough for them to be mine." The next day, Ezra readied 2 horses, packing saddlebags with supplies: dried food, water, rope. He sketched a rough map based on Ruth's letter. Grayson, Millersville, Elkhorn Tavern. "We'll go to Millersville first," he said. "Lydia's in the most immediate danger." Abigail had never ridden solo, but Ezra spent the morning teaching her how to hold the reins, how to lean into turns, how to brace on rough terrain. He never shouted, never rushed. When she fell, he helped her up, never laughing, only saying, "Try again. Keep your heels straighter this time." The ride to Millersville took 2 days. Abigail had never left Hardin County, so everything felt foreign. Endless plains like an ocean, skies so wide they swallowed thought, and quiet hamlets tucked beneath willow trees. They talked as they rode. Of childhood, of a mother who sang while kneading dough, of Catherine, who once embroidered Ezra's name into dish towels. Abigail recalled how the sisters shared one bed, trading spots when the blankets weren't enough. Ezra listened, never interrupted. Sometimes he smiled. Sometimes he simply stayed still. One night, camped under stars, wind whistling through canvas, Abigail said, "I used to dream about the ocean. They say it's bigger than the sky, endless." Ezra replied, "One day we'll go, you and me." It wasn't a proposal, not a promise, just together. And Abigail felt something soft break open inside her. They found Lydia in a rented attic above a general store, confined since her failed escape. She was sweeping the porch when Abigail approached, her steps slow and strained. Lydia looked up, her eyes unable to believe. "Abby, is it really you?" She dropped the broom, nearly collapsing. Abigail caught her in a gentle embrace like holding a wounded bird. Lydia's Master Prescott stepped out when he heard the commotion. "She's mine. I've got the paperwork to prove it." Ezra stepped forward, voice firm. "I'll buy her contract. Name your price." Prescott sneered. "Not for sale. I've got use for her." Ezra's gaze turned to ice. "Then be ready to explain the bruises to the sheriff." The standoff was tense, but with the eyes of the townsfolk on them and Ezra's quiet command, Prescott relented. He took $30 more than he'd paid, but less than it would have cost to defend a scandal. Lydia, trembling, followed them out of town. She couldn't speak at first, only clung to Abigail's arm as tears streamed silently. "I thought I'd never see you again," she whispered. "I thought I'd die in that attic." Abigail gripped her hand. "None of us are being left behind. I promise." Elkhorn Tavern wasn't like any place Abigail had ever seen. It wasn't a town. It was a crossing point for everything frayed: drunks, fugitives, rootless cowboys. The air reeked of stale beer, sweat, blood, and gunpowder. In the heart of that place stood the Elkhorn Saloon, where Abigail's twin sisters Esther and Naomi were locked away like caged birds. Ezra didn't let Abigail go in directly. They rented a small room in the only halfway decent boarding house nearby, secluded enough to watch without being noticed. For 3 days, they simply observed who went in and out, who guarded the door, when the shifts changed. They quickly realized Snake Morrison, the saloon owner, left every Tuesday at 10 a.m. for banking and business. He always took his 2 toughest men, leaving the saloon guarded only by an old bartender and a few sleeping drunks. "This is our only window," Ezra said. "Tuesday morning, that's the chance." "We'll need a distraction," Abigail noted. Lydia, still weak but steady, raised her hand. "I'll faint in front of the door." "No," Abigail said quickly. "They're my sisters, too," Lydia replied. "I won't sit safe while they're trapped." On Tuesday morning, just as the sun cleared the treetops, Snake Morrison climbed into his wagon and left the saloon right on schedule. He had no idea that 3 determined people were waiting for him to disappear, ready to undo what he thought was unbreakable. As soon as the wagon vanished, Lydia walked into the road, collapsed right in front of the saloon entrance. Inside, the bartender and several groggy patrons rushed out in alarm. While they fussed over Lydia, Abigail and Ezra slipped through the back entrance past the smoky kitchen and up the creaking staircase. The last door down the hall was padlocked. Ezra used a pry bar. With a sharp snap, the lock gave way. Inside, 2 girls huddled in dim light, rays filtering through torn curtains. Their faces were hollow, hair matted, limbs thin and bruised. But when they saw Abigail, they leapt to their feet. "Abby!" Their voices cracked, part sob, part disbelief. Abigail ran to them, arms wide. "I told you I'd come. I promised." Ezra didn't wait. "We leave. Now." They rushed back down, slipping through the saloon unnoticed as the crowd gathered around Lydia, who was now coming to in the arms of Reverend Silas Rowe, whom Ezra had summoned to witness and intervene should things go awry. But just as they mounted their horses and prepared to ride out, shouting erupted from the saloon. Snake Morrison had returned early. "Ride!" Ezra shouted. They galloped out of Elkhorn, hooves thundering, dust rising in swirls behind them. Gunfire cracked. Abigail clutched Naomi tightly. Lydia clung to Esther. The chase thundered on. Snake's men were gaining ground until a trumpet call pierced the air ahead. A cavalry patrol from Camp Knox had just arrived on the southern trail. Their commander, Lieutenant Theodore Collins, assessed the scene instantly and raised his hand. "Federal Army jurisdiction. Halt or be fired upon." Morrison and his men pulled up, snarling. "Those girls are my property," he barked, waving a few papers. Collins took them, glanced once, then shook his head. "Debt receipts, not legal ownership." He turned to Ezra and the others. "You're under the protection of the United States Army. No one touches you now." The group was escorted to the nearest town. Lydia received medical care. Esther and Naomi were examined for injuries. They were still weak, still shaken, but no longer silent ghosts. On the journey home, Abigail asked Ezra, "Why are you doing all this? They're not even really yours." Ezra stared ahead, where the afternoon sun painted gold across the prairie. "Family isn't just blood. It's choice. It's standing by someone when they need you most." Abigail didn't reply, but something in her heart shifted, not gratitude, not obligation love. Quiet, steadfast, and deep as the roots beneath their feet. The journey back took twice as long. Lydia still couldn't ride for long stretches and needed frequent rests. Esther and Naomi were fragile, flinching at sudden noises, their spirits frayed. But along the road, something unexpected began to happen. Quiet laughter when Naomi saw a squirrel chase their horses. Lydia recounting how she once hid in a tub full of scallion leaves to avoid being sold. Esther pointing to a cloud and saying, "It looks like the pie Ruth used to bake." No one corrected her. They camped often beneath the eaves of an abandoned chapel, beside bonfires with roasted corn, whispering stories under a sky filled with stars. Ezra rarely spoke, but he was always first to set up camp, boil water, and keep night watch like it was second nature. One evening, as Abigail washed her hands at a creek, Naomi crept up beside her and whispered, "Do you really love him?" Abigail didn't turn, but she replied softly, "I don't know, but I trust him." Naomi nodded, as if that answer was more than enough. When they reached the ranch, fall had already touched the land. Leaves turned bronze and the breeze carried a faint chill like silk threads. Ezra's log house appeared through the trees, familiar, steady. No one said a word, but their eyes swept the scene with quiet reverence. The low fence, the tomato rows, the chimney breathing wood smoke. The door opened. Abigail stepped in first, followed by Lydia, Esther, and Naomi. Each sister, as she passed Ezra, brushed his hand not with words, just a look that said, "Thank you." That evening, they sat around the old wooden table, sharing their first dinner under one roof in many months. The meal was simple: cornbread, boiled beans, smoked meat, and roasted squash. But they ate like it was a wedding feast. Abigail looked around the table. No one cried, but everyone's eyes shone. She thought of their mother. If she were alive, she'd be singing some song about autumn and saying, "My girls are home again." The new life began the next morning. Esther, restless as ever, asked to help Ezra with the horses. She learned quickly, and within a week she was riding Bishop, Ezra's black stallion no one else had dared mount. Naomi, quiet and nimble, began mending curtains, embroidering tablecloths, and even stitched a new apron for Abigail from scraps. Lydia, once strong enough, stepped into her role as the true eldest. She took charge of cooking, checked wounds, brewed herbal teas for Naomi's nighttime coughs. Ezra built 2 extra beds and cleared out the storage room to give Lydia her own space. Esther and Naomi still shared a room, just like they always had. Abigail didn't need instruction. She returned to gardening like she'd never left, cooked meals like she'd always had people to feed, and wiped counters like the world had nothing left to worry about. But each night she sat on the porch beside Ezra, saying little, just watching the sky fade behind the trees. 1 month later, a wagon pulled up to the gate. Out stepped Thomas Hale, Ruth's husband. Beside him stood Ruth herself, visibly pregnant, perhaps only months from delivering. When Ruth saw her sisters, she said nothing. She just ran to them, arms wide, and they all embraced. No words, no need. Ezra shook hands with Thomas, who looked him in the eye and said, "I don't know how to thank you. You saved my whole family." Ezra only smiled. "They're my family, too." From that day, Ezra's ranch seemed to expand, not just in people, but in spirit. There was more laughter, the smell of fresh bread in the morning, the sound of horses snorting in late dusk, rain tapping the porch roof, and warm evenings around the fireplace telling ghost stories like old times. No one spoke of the auction again. No one called Abigail the girl who was sold. She was now a woman of this house not because she married Ezra, but because she rebuilt it from the rubble. November arrived with chill winds, carrying the scent of burning leaves and damp earth. The ranch began to settle into the quiet of seasonal change. Bean rows pulled clean, tomatoes picked, squash vines tied in bundles and hung under the eaves to save for seed. The blazing sun of summer had faded into the pewter gray of overcast skies. In that stillness among the hush of the land, something quiet began to grow between Abigail and Ezra. Neither of them spoke it aloud, but the signs were everywhere. Ezra, typically reserved, began bringing things from town he had no real reason to buy: a length of pale blue linen, a carved wooden hairpin, a jar of plum preserves. Abigail began waiting for him in the evenings, not standing on the porch, not watching the road, but somehow dinner was always ready the moment he stepped through the door, and the kitchen lantern always lit just a bit early, though she'd insist it was just for warmth. One night, long after everyone else had gone to bed, Abigail sat alone on the porch swing, knitting a scarf. The wind hummed through the willow branches, the moon veiled by clouds. Ezra stepped out holding a cup of warm tea. "Aren't you cold?" Abigail didn't look up. "I am, but I like this kind of cold. It reminds me I'm still alive." Ezra sat beside her, silent for a while. Then he spoke, voice low and measured. "I used to think my heart had died with Catherine, but then you came, and everything stopped being quiet." Abigail paused her knitting. "I thought I'd never trust anyone again." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "But something in you kept me from stepping back." Ezra reached out carefully and touched the edge of the scarf in her lap. "Abigail, if you still need time, I'll wait. I won't ask anything from you but honesty. Whether it's no or not yet. I just want to be near you." Abigail stared into his storm-gray eyes, eyes that had always been steady as stone but now held the gentlest flicker of warmth. Not desire, not pity, just the invitation of safety. She laid her hand atop his. "I don't know if this is love the way people describe it, but I know when I see you riding home, my heart settles. When you laugh, I feel warm. When you hurt, I hurt. If that's not love, I don't know what to call it." Ezra said nothing. He leaned in, resting his forehead gently against hers. Their breaths mingled in the cold air, and for the first time, their lips met. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't trembling. It was the meeting of two people who had already belonged, now just arriving at the final point of contact. The next morning, Abigail woke before anyone else. She lit the fire, made breakfast as usual, but her hands moved lighter. Her eyes gleamed brighter. Esther glanced at her and turned away with a small smile. Naomi nudged her toward the window where Ezra was splitting wood. "They finally found each other," she whispered. Lydia shrugged. "They didn't need to say it. It's been clear for a while." That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Ezra sat beside his bed and opened an old wooden box. Inside was a ring and emerald set in a fading silver band. It had belonged to his grandmother, passed down 3 generations. He said nothing, but he knew. The time had come. Not to begin something, but to acknowledge what had already grown quietly for months, a love that didn't arrive like thunder, but like winter laying its silent claim. 3 days after the season's first snow dusted the barn roof in white, Ezra asked Abigail to follow him into the back garden early one morning. "I want to show you something," he said, shovel in hand. Abigail blinked. "We're planting in winter now?" "Not planting," Ezra replied, leading her to the plot behind the withered squash trellis. "Just showing you what you've done to this place." He pointed to a bed of earth. Abigail recognized it. It was where she'd planted her first beans upon arriving. Now the soil had been turned, fertilized, and neatly bordered with bricks ready for the next sowing. "See that?" Ezra said softly. "You came here, and everything started to come alive." Before she could answer, he turned and pulled a small walnut box from his coat pocket. Her breath caught. Ezra knelt not with fanfare, not with spectacle, just with sincerity. "The first time I gave you my name," he said, "it was to save you. But today, if you'll have it, I'd like you to carry it, because you've chosen it." He opened the box. Inside, a silver ring with a tiny emerald glinted in the morning sun. Not to escape the past, not out of gratitude, but because we want to move forward together." Abigail stood frozen. Wind tugged at her coat. A distant horse neighed. Then she slowly knelt beside him, placing her hand in his. "The first time I took your name, it was to survive," she said. "This time, I choose you, to live." Ezra smiled a smile she had never seen before, full and unburdened. He slid the ring onto her finger, rose, and pulled her into his arms. And in the quiet cold of that morning, that snowy garden became the place where a true vow was made. Their second wedding took place on the first day of spring when the ice melted. The sky turned blue again, and the earth smelled of new beginnings. There were no courthouse steps, no shouted bids, just a small patch of earth, family arms, and real joy. Reverend Silas Rowe again stood with them. Abigail wore the dress Naomi had hand-stitched through January ivory, simple, cinched with a blue ribbon the color of Catherine's eyes. Esther led the horses. Lydia baked the wedding bread. Ruth brought her baby girl, barely 3 months old, and placed her in Naomi's arms to hold during the ceremony. No one cried, but everyone's eyes glistened. Ezra held Abigail's hands and said, "I don't need you to be anyone else. You, as you are more than I ever thought I'd have again." Abigail replied, "I didn't come to replace Catherine, but I promised to carry forward the love she began in this home." They kissed not as a promise, but as a confirmation. Every hardship, every loss had led them to something worthy. That spring, their home became the center of everything. Thomas and Ruth moved their ranch closer. Lydia opened a small medicine room to help women across the county. Esther raised horses and taught riding. Naomi ran a little sewing corner with orders from 3 towns. And Abigail, she was the heart of it all, the one who lit the stove each morning, who welcomed laughter into the kitchen, who stood at the doorway each evening when the wind carried the scent of new grass, watching for Ezra's silhouette beyond the western trees. Then, one evening in May, as the wind carried mustard blossom and the sun dipped behind the hill, Abigail rested her hand on her belly. Her breath had changed. Something inside had begun. She said nothing. She just reached for Ezra's hand, placed it gently over her own, and whispered, "We're about to grow a new season." The following October, Kentucky's skies hung heavy with wool-gray clouds, the air laced with the iron scent of coming frost. In a room lit by oil lamps, Abigail gripped Ezra's hand, her forehead damp, breaths ragged. Lydia, now an experienced midwife, pressed a hand to Abigail's belly and whispered, "It's close now. Just once more, Abby." And then, between the wind rattling the windows and the fire murmuring in the hearth, a newborn's cry pierced the room. Loud, strong, sure. A baby boy with storm-gray eyes like his father and a pointed chin just like his mother. Ezra leaned down and cradled the boy in his arms. He couldn't speak, he only wept. Abigail, exhausted but radiant, reached up and brushed his cheek. "James Patrick Townsend," she whispered. The name was passed on, not as remembrance of one lost, but to welcome one beginning. That child grew up beneath the eaves that had once witnessed girls auctioned like cattle, now a home where women chose their paths freely. In the back garden, Ruth taught her daughter to dig furrows. Lydia taught field medicine to girls from nearby homesteads. Esther rode across 3 counties delivering stud horses. Naomi sewed school uniforms for a newly opened community school. And Abigail, still the quiet center, lit the stove each dawn, told stories each night, and made sure Ezra always came home to warm bread and a full table. When James turned 7, he asked his mother, "Ma, how did you and Pa meet?" Abigail smiled, setting down the book in her lap. "Once, I stood on the courthouse steps where men shouted numbers like they were bidding on horses. One by one, my sisters were taken. Then only I was left. And then Pa showed up? Your father didn't shout a price. He stepped from the crowd and said, I want to marry her, not buy her. What did you say? I said, I don't know who you are, but if you promise to treat me as a person, not a possession, I'll say yes. James tilted his head. So, love started at an auction. Abigail laughed softly. No, darling, love started with a choice. Years later, when Ezra and Abigail's hair had turned to silver, their home remained a way station in a noisy world. Their grandchildren ran wild through the yard-climbing troughs, chasing chickens, reading books in the garden. Inside the house, just beside the window, hung a small photo. 5 women standing shoulder to shoulder, hands clasped. Ruth, Lydia, Abigail, Esther, Naomi. Each staring at the camera with eyes lit by a fire that had survived hell and still chose to build a little heaven. Next to it, a carved wooden plaque bore the words, "Family isn't what you're born into, it's what you dare to keep." In the same land where girls were once sold to pay debts, children now gathered for summer reading festivals. The old courthouse had become a library. Elkhorn Tavern was shut down, and Snake Morrison, long disgraced, had faced charges for crimes far beyond what anyone once whispered. No one spoke much of that auction anymore, but everyone remembered the man who halted it with a humble vow, and the girl who stepped toward the uncertain, trusting that something better might wait for her there. And so, from a terrible beginning, a family was reborn. Not from wealth, not from blood, but from quiet choices, persistent kindness, and courageous belief. From a hand extended when another was falling. From a porch that never closed its door to someone in need. From faith that even what has been shattered can still form the foundation of something stronger.